This is not a drill, nor is it a routine bulletin from behind the high stone walls of Buckingham Palace. What has transpired within the last hour represents nothing less than a silent, ruthless restructuring of an ancient dynasty, an unprecedented seizure of absolute authority that has left the establishment reeling in disbelief. For centuries, the line of succession was an unshakable law, forged in iron and tradition. But tonight, that sacred order has been shattered from within. An extraordinary emergency gathering was summoned under the guise of a final national address, a solemn farewell from a declining sovereign. But as the heavy oak doors of the Great Hall swung shut, sealing out the press, those present realized they were not attending a farewell. They were witnessing a palace coup, executed with clinical precision from the throne itself. Beside the chair of state stood a sight that sent shockwaves through the gathered elite, a second, unscripted crown resting upon dark velvet, like a declaration of war. No courtier had been warned. Queen Camilla sat several paces removed, her face frozen in rigid composure, entirely ignorant that her governing influence was being erased in real time. Then, the monarch rose. King Charles, visibly weighed down by the mantle of his final months, called Catherine forward. Before the nation could absorb what it was witnessing, the king lifted the ceremonial crown with trembling hands and publicly named her the new leader of the crown. This was no mere honorary gesture. Charles declared Catherine the supreme authority over the family's public duties, discipline, and national representation, granting her the mandate to settle domestic disputes and dictate how the House of Windsor would present itself. Catherine did not flinch, though the weight of the moment threatened to crush her. Across the suffocating silence, her eyes locked with Prince William's. The future king answered with a single, restrained nod, a silent pact forged in the shadows of an extraordinary transformation. As Charles struggled to hold the gold, Catherine reached out, her fingers steadying his frail wrist. In that subtle touch, the shift of power was laid bare. Camilla's expression hardened into stone. The queen consort was discovering that the official proclamation, finalized in secrecy earlier that morning, gave her no governing role, no private veto, and no place in the decisions ahead. Charles placed the crown upon Catherine's head, declaring her the guardian of the institution's future. When the monarch pushed aside his prepared speech, declaring that the future must be led by strength that does not seek power, thunderous applause erupted. Yet Princess Anne was not watching the crown. Her gaze was fixed on a sealed red folder beneath her brother's chair, containing the private reasons why Charles had chosen Catherine over every other senior royal. For the watching world, it was a historic transfer of authority. For the four people closest to the throne, it was an agonizing declaration of war. Catherine had been elevated without warning. William had watched his wife receive power usually reserved for the sovereign. Camilla had been publicly displaced, while Charles had surrendered his final responsibility. Behind their controlled expressions, 4 private battles had begun. Retreating from the hall, Catherine carried the crown into a private antechamber. She placed it upon a narrow table and pressed her hands against the wood, listening as the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. William stood in the shadows, his jaw tight. The silence between husband and wife was thick with dread. Catherine turned, asking whether the king's public announcement had humiliated him, whether receiving power before his reign had severed the trust between them. William stepped closer but did not touch the crown. He admitted humiliation was not what frightened him. His terror came from watching Catherine inherit the exact pressure that had once consumed his mother, Princess Diana. The insatiable judgment and the brutal demand to remain pristine, while private pain became public fodder. Looking into his eyes, she realized his stillness was pure protective horror. Before they could speak further, Princess Anne entered the antechamber, her presence cold and commanding. William demanded to know why his wife had been thrust into the line of fire. Anne looked toward the crown and delivered a chilling truth. The decision was not based on popularity or public affection. The king had selected Catherine because she had passed a secret test of character that every other senior royal had failed. When William asked when this test occurred, Anne answered with one date, the night of the Windsor Founders Ceremony, 6 months earlier. Behind locked doors that night, an explosive confrontation had altered the monarch's perception forever. 6 months before the ceremonial crown touched her head, the foundation of the royal house was nearly destroyed behind the mahogany doors of the king's private library. The public saw only the Windsor Founders Ceremony, a gilded gathering designed to project stability and ancestral continuity. But beneath the polished language of statehood lay a ruthless administrative trap, a secret public duty framework crafted by senior advisors. It was a cold, calculated strategy designed to quietly exclude several younger family members from active service, stripping their duties without explanation to shield the monarchy from potential scandal. It was a purge disguised as prudence, and Charles had accepted it as a necessity. He had not anticipated Catherine. Summoned to the library immediately following the ceremony, the Princess of Wales was handed the leather-bound document and ordered to sign. She did not raise her voice. She read the final clause slowly, closed the crimson file, and pushed it across the monarch's desk. In a room where royal commands had gone unquestioned for generations, Catherine refused. She declared that she would never sign a mandate that sacrificed innocent lives to project a false image of security. Charles felt the refusal like a blow, a defiance within his own walls. He accused her of sabotaging his authority at the precise hour he needed total allegiance. Catherine's hands trembled, but her voice did not waver. She warned him that forced silence could never build trust, and that a crown preserved through injustice was already hollow. She walked out into the corridor shaken, fully aware of the consequences. As William would later reveal in a confidential audio recording now locked within the palace archives, Catherine was prepared to lose everything that night. She anticipated the stripping of her patronages, the revocation of her private access, and exile from inner court decisions. Yet she never leaked a word to the press, never sought sympathy, and never used the dispute to weaken the king's standing. Her silence was not submission. It was a shield drawn around the sovereign whose decree she had defied. The revelation came 24 hours later. An internal review reached the king's desk, exposing that two senior advisors had concealed evidence and exaggerated risks to force the king into signing the framework. The shock was absolute. Catherine's defiance had been the single barrier saving the monarchy from a catastrophic moral blunder. Charles called her back. There was no apology from the monarch, only a haunting question. Would she have defied him if William had supported the plan? Catherine held his gaze without hesitation. Yes, because the crown cannot demand what it would be ashamed to explain. In that quiet room, Charles began drafting the secret leadership proclamation. He recognized that blind obedience was an invitation to manipulation, and that the institution required a leader whose loyalty was anchored in judgment. But secrecy within palace walls is fragile. It was not long before Queen Camilla uncovered the drafting process, transforming a policy shift into an all-out war for survival. An early version of the decree had secured Camilla's position as supreme advisor, granting her senior guardianship over family governance. But as the king refined the text in isolation, he quietly excised her title, replacing it with powers granted exclusively to Catherine. When Camilla retrieved the modified draft from an unsecured terminal, the betrayal cut to the bone. She was being stripped of any governing authority in the era to come. The confrontation took place in a secluded drawing room, behind locked doors with no aides to buffer the impact. Camilla confronted Catherine directly, her composure shattered. The queen consort accused Catherine of weaponizing her apparent modesty, claiming her quiet persona was a masterstroke of strategy. She argued that courtiers trusted Catherine precisely because she pretended not to seek power, making her infinitely more dangerous than those who fought openly for influence. Catherine listened in stillness. She revealed that she had begged Charles to reconsider, warning him that creating such an office would fracture the family. But the king had refused, warning her that a divided court was already attempting to usurp control before William's accession. Camilla's restraint snapped. Producing a copy of the initial draft, she threw it onto the table, demanding to know if Catherine truly believed she possessed the right to displace the queen consort. Catherine did not recoil. "I intend to stand where duty places me," she replied, "even when that place is unbearable." The opening of the double doors cut through the atmosphere. King Charles stepped inside, his eyes moving between his wife and daughter-in-law. Camilla demanded to know if the draft bearing her name meant nothing to him. Charles looked at his wife, his voice heavy with finality. "It meant I once believed loyalty alone could save us. Now I know that judgment must lead." He announced that the final proclamation would be sealed before dawn. The queen walked out without another word, closing the door behind her with terrifying restraint. The line had been drawn, and the palace was about to fracture. The crown placed upon Catherine's head was designed to look ceremonial. The document locked beneath it was not. Hidden within the final clauses of Charles's proclamation lay executive powers capable of reordering the entire machinery of the royal household. The throne still belonged to the king, and the line of succession remained untouched for Prince William. Yet the daily operational command of the monarchy had been handed entirely to Catherine. Designated as leader of the crown, her new authority effectively severed active governance from constitutional title. She now possessed the absolute mandate to coordinate senior duties, allocate long-term charitable priorities, enforce internal discipline, and determine precisely who was permitted to represent the sovereign in public life. It was a staggering division of control. One title carried the crown, but the other commanded the machinery that sustained it. William had recognized the peril immediately. To grant his wife such sweeping oversight without the constitutional immunity of a sovereign was to place her directly in the line of fire. She would bear the full responsibility for every suspended patronage, every royal exclusion, and every internal restructuring, becoming the target for every grievance within the family. In the quiet hours before dawn, Charles had confessed to Princess Anne that placing such a weight upon Catherine felt almost cruel. Yet the monarch remained unyielding. He believed that without a single, uncompromising hand directing the institution, rival factions would fracture the royal family beyond repair before William ever reached the throne. Anne watched her brother sign the final page of the document. As dawn approached, the king's hand hovered above the parchment, his fingers trembling before the last letter of his name. Anne placed her palm flat against the desk beside him, providing silent support. Once the ink dried, Charles pressed the royal seal into red wax, the official mark confirming monarchical authority. Then, turning to his sister, he requested a final, drastic act. Taking the silver seal, Anne snapped it in two over a heavy tray, ensuring that no subsequent order could ever overwrite this decree. But the moment of triumph was instantly shattered. Before the ink had fully cured, an unsigned copy vanished from the private office. Within hours, security checks revealed that the document had been accessed using William's private office code, a digital signature deliberately manipulated to frame the future king and plant toxic suspicion between husband and wife before Catherine had even chaired her first meeting. The first manifestation of the new order did not arrive through an official public statement. It came through the quiet removal of a single chair. Less than 60 minutes after the public ceremony concluded, Catherine summoned her first leadership council. She immediately issued a 48-hour freeze on all public announcements, preventing rival factions from rushing through unauthorized appointments. Attendance at the table was stripped of hereditary entitlement, restricted exclusively to those carrying active duty. When Queen Camilla entered the council chamber expecting her accustomed position at the king's right hand, she froze. Her chair had been completely removed from the room. For several suffocating seconds, total silence gripped the room. Camilla turned her eyes toward Charles, waiting for her husband to intervene and demand the restoration of her status. But the king remained motionless, his gaze fixed ahead. That silence wounded her far more deeply than any formal exclusion, signaling to the court that the monarch would uphold Catherine's executive command, even at the cost of his own marriage. Without uttering a word, Camilla turned and retreated. Returning to her private sitting room, she unclasped the gold brooch Charles had gifted her at the start of his reign, laying it beside the unopened proclamation. Inside the council chamber, Catherine observed the empty space. Refusing to allow Camilla's exclusion to become a spectacle of humiliation, she ordered another chair brought in, yet she did not invite the queen consort back into the session. Instead, her very first directive was an uncompromising command: a full security investigation into the vanished document, accompanied by strict orders forbidding staff from deleting access logs or correspondence. When the advisors were dismissed and the heavy doors closed, only William and Catherine remained in the room. The atmosphere was dense with unspoken tension. William stepped forward, the shadow of the compromised office code looming between them. He looked into his wife's eyes and asked the question neither had dared voice. "Do you truly trust me?" Catherine looked back, her composed exterior finally breaking. She confessed her deep fear, not of public scrutiny, but of being driven into a position that created a rival court between them. William took her hands, reassuring her that while the secrecy of Charles's decision had wounded him, his allegiance to her leadership was absolute. The crown case rested between them. Catherine offered to return it to the king if it stood between their union, but William closed the lid and pushed it gently back to her. "The burden is not the enemy," he said. "Secrecy is." Together, they resolved that every major decision would be forged in private unity, standing firm just as the leaked document hit the morning headlines. By sunrise, the secret text of the proclamation had breached the palace walls, igniting a national storm that no public relations office could suppress. News networks across the globe interrupted regular broadcasts, declaring the dawn of an unprecedented era. Active governance of the royal family had been placed in the hands of Catherine, Princess of Wales, while the line of succession remained unbroken for Prince William. To neutralize distorting rumors of a quiet abdication or a constitutional crisis, Palace Communications released the document in its entirety. The nation was confronted with a staggering truth. Catherine had not been granted an empty ceremonial title, but executive command over the monarchy's operational soul. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, thousands gathered under a relentless downpour, holding morning papers with headlines proclaiming a dramatic restructuring. Yet behind the palace windows, there were no celebrations. The court understood that the public enthusiasm masking the streets was merely the outer shell of a grim, irreversible sacrifice. As Catherine stepped into her new office, the illusion of personal sanctuary dissolved entirely. The fatalism of her reality settled over her like lead. Her appointment was not a triumph of ambition, but a sentence to lifelong vigilance. Every decision regarding royal patronages, every internal allocation of resources, and every disciplinary action would now pass through her desk, bearing her personal responsibility. She was no longer merely a beloved public figure sheltered by the institution. She had become the institution's shield, absorbing the hostility, envy, and scrutiny meant for the crown itself. Standing at the tall windows overlooking the misty palace gardens, she felt the oppressive weight of an ancient machine that demanded complete self-erasure in exchange for continuity. There would be no reprieve, no private retreat, and no turning back. She had accepted a crown built not of gold, but of duty, isolation, and unyielding expectation. Beside her, Prince William accepted his own redefined reality with quiet, resolute fatalism. The poison of court speculation, which had sought to cast him as a jealous heir displaced by his own wife, was crushed under the weight of their unified front. The future king understood that his true duty lay in shielding the woman who had agreed to carry the institutional burden before his reign even began. In public, they appeared together with absolute composure, their synchronized steps sending an undeniable signal to every faction within the establishment that the throne and its leadership were fused in purpose. But in the quiet corridor outside their private quarters, the cost of that unity was plain. They walked not as triumphant victors, but as partners who had surrendered their private peace to secure the dynasty's future. They knew that from this moment onward, their marriage would be observed through the cold lens of history, where every glance and silence would be parsed for signs of fracture. For Queen Camilla and the old guard of advisors who had once wielded quiet dominance over palace policy, the storm had cleared to reveal absolute ruin. The loss of power was total, final, and merciless. Deprived of executive function, private vetoes, and her familiar seat at the governing table, the queen consort found herself reduced to a spectator in a court she had spent decades navigating. Her network of influential aides scattered or aligned themselves with the new leadership, recognizing that influence had irrevocably shifted. Sitting in her private drawing room, surrounded by unanswered correspondence and the silence of stripped authority, Camilla faced the cold truth of palace life. Loyalty to the past offers no immunity against the demands of the future. The door to governance had closed without noise or spectacle, locking her outside the room where decisions were made. In the cold calculus of the monarchy, her chapter of political influence had reached its bitter end. King Charles, having executed the most radical decision of his reign, quietly withdrew into the background. His constitutional position as sovereign remained intact, but he had surrendered the active helm of the family he had led through years of public turbulence. Sitting in his dimly lit study, listening to the rain beat against the heavy window panes, the king felt the profound, tragic peace of a monarch who had completed his final task. He had not acted out of malice toward his wife, nor out of favoritism toward Catherine, but out of a desperate conviction that the monarchy required a moral anchor capable of surviving the storms ahead. He had willingly fractured his own domestic peace to ensure that the House of Windsor would not crumble from within. He had placed the crown's future into hands that had proven their strength, knowing that history would judge his choice long after his own reign had passed into memory. The House of Windsor has always endured through relentless adaptation, sacrificing individuals upon the altar of continuity whenever survival demanded it. Empires fall, rulers pass, and titles fade, but the crown remains, an unyielding symbol forged in centuries of sacrifice, duty, and tragic resolve. This dark transition was not a victory for any single figure, but a sobering reminder that true authority is never given. It is borne by those willing to stand at the center of the storm when all others break. As the night descends over the capital and the great iron gates seal out the world, the story of power continues in silence. Thank you for watching. If you found this deep dive into royal history and hidden palace dynamics compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next investigation into the secrets behind the throne.